Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Matt, for the introduction, and thank you, Sam, for your talk, which is really fascinating. I think what I'm planning to do now is look at another source of data and another study of Windermere, but from a very different perspective. So I'll be talking a little bit about a project we've completed over a 6-month period that was finished in February this year. But before I do that, I'll just give a quick introduction to who Map Impact are. So our mission is to empower the best decisions for nature. We are an environmental data services company, providing novel data from innovative technology. And at the core of everything we do is collaboration. And I think that's what brings us here today is a collaborative approach to everything we do. We're very, very keen to partner with as many organizations as we can. We realize that the decline in nature cannot be tackled by single organizations on their own. And so there's a need for all sorts of organizations to come together, work together and collaborate to solve some of the problems we have around nature decline. Before I move on to talk about this project, I'll just quickly mention our flagship data product, which is called Biodiversity View. So this is a national biodiversity data layer, which we launched at the end of last year. We've actually spoken in 2 other webinars with the Biological Recording Company about this, so there's prior recordings on this data. But this is a nationally available data layer that provides an indication of habitat and, importantly, biodiversity condition across England, Wales and Scotland. And it's available on demand. So for anyone who's interested in terrestrial, this is focusing on terrestrial ecology and biodiversity at landscape scale. Please do get in touch with us to learn more about this. We're happy to talk to anyone about that product. But my focus today will be talking about a project that we delivered, as I said, in February this year. So it was a 6-month project that was commissioned by the UK Space Agency. So the UK Space Agency put out a call for projects called climate services. And the idea was that they would support 6-month-long projects in order to prove a concept around climate, around data and innovative services that would support understanding of climate with space data as part of that. There's a nice kind of soundbite here from the Chief Executive of the UK Space Agency regarding these projects. And the key thing in here is this idea of putting funding into small projects to support fresh ideas and accelerate the rollout of new tools to essentially to new users. So something that I'm very passionate about is trying to break down the barriers of access to technology, and in particular access to space-based data and technology, because I believe it has applications across society that are not fully being realized yet. So this is a really nice example of that, where we were throughout this project, which is what I'll describe in the next sort of 15-20 minutes, is taking satellite data and looking at new applications of it. So the objective of the project was to provide new perspectives on Windermere, using novel data sources and performing analysis from a catchment-wide perspective. I won't go over. Sam's already given a really good overview of Windermere, and in the same vein as Sam, I'm definitely not an expert on Windermere itself. For us, this just proved to be a very, very good place to prove this technology, really, to test and prove this technology could be applied. It's got a variety of different influencing factors on what's going on in the lake. And I think the novelty of what we wanted to do and what satellites can bring to this is this catchment-wide perspective. So where Sam's given examples of data being applied at a very, very precise location, what we can bring going completely to the other end of the spectrum is this catchment wide understanding, and that's what we've aimed to do within this project, is use data at that scale. So when you're I will, as I go through this presentation and talk about this project and talk about some of the outcomes, what I want to do is be very open about the limitations as well. There are limitations of working at this scale. So what I really believe is that this data does have a place to play, but it can't answer everything. It needs to be combined with other data and technology, and it needs to be aligned with other data and technology. So the way I think about this is that satellites and this level of understanding offer a tool within the toolbox, but it can't be used necessarily on its own. So that's sort of something I want to be quite open about, really, is the limitations of what we've done. And I think it's important to be open about those limitations, so that you can understand how the data can be used and applied in the end. And also so that we can work with others to try and mitigate some of those limitations, which is something I'm very interested in, having a lot more conversations about what we've done with others. So the project started in October last year, and we started with a community engagement workshop where we had roundtable discussions with a variety of different stakeholders from the community in Windermere. And the headline that we're looking at here, we asked a lot of questions, had a lot of discussions, but the headline question that we were asking was, what are the factors that influences the lake's water quality? So we drew out a lot of other things from this workshop, but really what we came to in the end was that we were going to, the outcome of this was really to look at 3 different factors, which is where we focused. So we're looking at things around what we call inadequate infrastructure, and we've taken a novel approach to how we might bring some new data to understand that. We've looked at weather and climate, and again, we've done that entirely remotely and at a large scale. So we've taken some different data sets to come into that factor and how that influences the lake's water quality. And then finally, we've looked at land use and agriculture. And we've taken a different approach to that as well, again, using satellite data. So what we wanted to do here was use a range of new and novel data sources to look at each of these factors and how they influence the lake's water quality. So the questions that we're trying to answer is, can we use satellite imagery to monitor the algal blooms in Lake Windermere? So Sam already alluded to it a little bit earlier on in his conversation. Increases in algae are harmful to the lake because it can smother many other things. It depletes oxygen within the lake, which can harm many other things. It can get to a state where it's actually harmful to human health when we have these algal blooms really peaking. So we wanted to understand whether satellite imagery could be used to monitor algal blooms within Lake Windermere. That's our first question. We then wanted to look at whether we could correlate the blooms with specific influencing factors. So that takes us back to the previous page and some of those factors that we're looking at, and whether we could bring in new data to understand connections between that data and algae bloom events. We then wanted to look at some specific example ecological incidents and seeing whether what we could understand using satellite imagery. So to begin with, I'll just talk through and show some highlights of what we did with how we really looked at satellite imagery to understand what's going on in the lake in terms of algal content. So to start with, we decided to essentially split the basin and the catchment area into two parts. So the North Basin and the South Basin. And the reason behind this is the two act quite differently. There's various different characteristics in the north part of Windermere compared to the south. And by splitting this up, we could begin to look at those in isolation. So we're looking at this on a catchment-wide basis, but in order to sort of draw out some more understanding, we essentially split the lake in two with a north-south split. We analysed over 1,500 satellite images within the project for all of the different factors that I've talked about, as well as understanding the water itself. We were analysing images to understand what's going on in the wider catchment, and I'll explain that in a bit more detail. But I just wanted to highlight a couple of images straight away, which even with even with the naked eye, we can look at these satellite images, and they begin to show algae events. You can see here an example of an algal bloom in Esthwaite in June 2022. This was around the time of the fish death incident that Sam talked about. So you can see that just with the naked eye, without me running any analysis on this image, I can see that there's an algae event there. And the same with the algae bloom that happened in August 2022. So we took a large stack of images from the past 4 years, and we analysed a lot of those. What we were looking for, what we were looking to do was take our analysis beyond just looking at the normal a normal image that you might see, like the one in the previous slide, where you can, that's kind of a normal satellite image that you might see on something like Google Earth or Google Maps. The imagery we're using actually has it records a wider part of the light spectrum than you can see with your naked eye. So we're recording parts of the infrared and near infrared light spectrum that allow us to understand some interesting things begin to understand some interesting things about chlorophyll. So we used what we call an index, which is called MCI, Maximum Chlorophyll Index, which is a well-known water index for recording and beginning to actually draw out what that chlorophyll content is in the water in a measured manner. So when we look at the example here on the right hand side, this is just taken from an example paper, one of the sources that we use within the study, just at a very high level to show how the light behaves when we're recording an image, and the difference between what we would see in what we might call clean water and then water that's got algae within it. So we can study the light wavelength and how that's been recorded to understand quantity of algae and measure that in a consistent and objective way. So again, I'll be moving through this quite quickly, and at the end I'll show an example of, or I'll show the report that we've actually published on this, which is completely open for anyone to go and have a look at. What I've done here is just draw out some examples, and I'm having to move through many topics very quickly, so I'll be skipping over a few things quite rapidly. But the point of this slide on the screen here really is to highlight at the top there, this is the algae event that I showed that you could see with the naked eye. So in the top left here, you can see the green in the water without actually having to do any of this infrared analysis. What the point of showing this image is at the bottom here, there's things here that we can't see with the naked eye, but when we run that MCI, when we run that chlorophyll index, we can begin to see chlorophyll content within here. So there's things that using this infrared data allows us to draw things out of the imagery that we couldn't normally see. And what we did is we ran this index for the previous 4 years. So over the previous 4 years, we're using a satellite that's capturing data at least weekly. There is a big but in that, because the but is that we need to have clear cloud-free conditions. So what that means is between 2019 and 2023, what we actually had was roughly 100 images that we could use within that time frame, and you can see them plotted out here. And the purple lines that are drawn within here are showing where there was a known algae bloom event recorded. So we're able to use this to almost partly calibrate what we were doing to show that where we saw these peaks in our MCI, our chlorophyll index, we were also seeing an alignment with recorded algae bloom events. So that's a very, very quick whistle-stop tour of what we did to actually measure the water and understand chlorophyll within the water. As I said, a lot more detail on everything I'm talking about within the report, which there'll be a link to within the chat, which anyone can access. So moving on very quickly, the next question we wanted to ask is, can we correlate the blooms with specific influencing factors? And again, I'm going to move through this at pace because I'm quite short of time to cover a lot of different topics here. But the first thing we wanted to look at was human movement. What we wanted to do, we had from this initial workshop we had, from the early conversations we had, we knew there was some limitations essentially around the infrastructure around Lake Windermere and how human waste essentially is being treated. And so what we wanted to do was find a proxy to really see if we could try and understand what's going on with human waste and connecting that to people. So everyone carries a mobile phone with them. And what we were able to do within this project was get access to anonymized mobile phone data. So when you're wherever you are with your mobile phone, it's constantly the location of your mobile phone is constantly anonymously being recorded. And the way that's being recorded is through triangulation with phone masts that are all around you. But this is going on at scale. So we were able to access mobile phone data that had been anonymized. There's no way, there's a method that meant there's no way it could be linked back to individual people. But what it is very useful for is showing how many people are in a specific location at a specific time. And what we did was we took this data on 24-hour periods. So we said how many people are in the North catchment and how many people are in the South catchment for any 24-hour period. And at the headline sort of big numbers that we saw, big differences we saw were in 2020, when we had this actually very good, the lockdown provided us with a very good almost test case for what the base population should look like. So the typical baseline population within the Windermere catchment is about 40,000 people. And we saw that within in March and April 2020. But then in August 2020, when there was we were still in lockdown, there was a stop on international travel. We saw many people coming into the catchment, and the peak that we saw was 320,000 people in a single day. So equivalent to the population of Nottingham coming into the Windermere catchment. So this graph shows some of that over a slightly longer time series, and you can actually see on the far left here we've got the purple being the north, the orange being the south basin. So you can see this combined number during the peak lockdown period of about 40,000 people. Then we saw in summer 2020 these huge peaks in population, and then throughout each summer we also see these peaks. And you can pick out things like weekend peaks, where you get peaks in visitors, and it gets higher and lower weekends versus weekdays, higher during the summer. Now, the interesting thing about this is that this data is that there's data recording how many people generally, open data generally recorded on how many people come into the national park, but not down to this catchment basis. So a really nice novel data set that we could use to show how many people were in the catchment on a 24-hour period. We then took that data and these 24-hour each 24-hour periods, and we correlated that back to where we'd seen algal events and peaks and troughs in algae. And we saw statistically significant correlations between chlorophyll and numbers of people using two separate satellite sources. So we had 2 or 3 different satellites that we were drawing upon within the project. We saw these connections between the data in 2 of them. There's some interesting things around lag time. So what we tended to see was that where we had peaks in population, a few days later we'd then see an algal event. So we can sort of track that pattern. We begin to draw that out and analyze all of that. So as I said, very quick overview, but this is the first factor that we looked at was human movement. We next went on to have a look at land use, and using that as a proxy for what's going on with agriculture, understanding what's happening across the base, across the catchment area. And what we could see here, we performed, again, this is all extracted from satellite data, a detailed land cover analysis of what's going on across the catchment area. And what we found is that you've got this relatively stable situation with land use. So you can see from some of the change analysis that we did over time, what you're seeing is that there's this constant going on. Now, the point here that I make quite regularly about this is that we're not saying that agriculture is not a contribute. I'm not saying that it isn't contributing to chlorophyll. So there's lots of known work on how these agricultural work, agricultural influences, and the runoff from that impact chlorophyll. We're acknowledging that, but what we couldn't see was a link between changes in land use and changes in agriculture and the spikes that we saw in chlorophyll and the algae bloom events as a factor. So we know that this is an underlying factor that's within there, but we couldn't connect that to the spikes in chlorophyll that we could with other factors. So the final factor that I'll talk about is weather and climate. So we looked at a variety of different indicators of weather and climate. We looked at river flow. We looked at correlations between river flow and algae content. Again, we saw this correlation in the North Basin between river flow and algae, but only in the North Basin. So that's something that is partly, I'd say, an outstanding question of this research. Why did we only see this there? We did see this statistically significant connection between temperature and chlorophyll, so that does exist within there. But then we also saw anomalous events, we'd call them, where we couldn't see a connection between algae and temperature. So that brought us to question what else is influencing those events. And I think the conclusion that's not necessarily a surprising conclusion is that impacts don't work in isolation. So you've got all of these things influencing the lake. And what we've done is try to draw out a lot of these factors, connect them to what's going on in the lake, but they don't work in an isolated manner. They're all partly contributing in different ways. It's highly complex, and a lot of complexity in how they interact, but they're not just working alone. So finally, what we wanted to do was look at some specific recent incidents, and we've talked a little bit about this already, but there was a large bloom event in August 2022, and what we wanted to do was do some analysis around that event. Again, in our report that the link is in the chat for, we've done a lot more analysis on other events, but just wanted to draw this one out and highlight it. So what you had in this situation was that prior to the bloom, you had high water temperature where it's staying above 19 degrees uninterrupted for 7 days. That's very warm for the lake. And then we also saw this period where we've got very high visitor numbers as well for the preceding 10 days. So what we're seeing is these two factors combining together to influence the bloom event that's coming, and we can make those connections between between how strong that bloom event was and these factors that were influencing it. So what have we learned? Well, satellites can see and they can track algae formation in Windermere, and we think we should continue to be using this to our advantage. So this satellite data that we've used, the majority of it is open source. It's freely available, and it just requires that interpretation to draw out the information from it. So we believe that should be something that's continuing into the future. It should be used as much as possible to give us that large area indication of what's going on in the water. We have seen this connection between temperature and human movement, and that connection to recent algae blooms, and therefore what should we target, temperature or human waste? And you know, at the end of all of this, it has to be about the partial and, if possible, the complete nutrient removal within the lake, which is obviously a huge challenge, and it requires many stakeholders to be looking at this. So just before I finish, what I want to emphasize again is that this report is is open for anyone to download. We've tried to be very open about the limitations of what we've done. We've described all the methods within there. We are very open to providing our actual raw data with anyone who can use it. So I'm very keen to speak to anyone who could make use of our raw data. And what we wanted to do was just, as I said at the beginning, just bring new ways of working, new ways of thinking to this, to try and draw out some new evidence. And I think the point is that everyone really has to start coming together, combining all of this evidence together to be able to help solve some of the problems that we've got here. So I'll finish there and take any questions.
Thanks, Richard.